Hi, Brian here once again. Back when I get into Warhammer again after a 22-year break, the first big purchase I made was the Kill Team Octarius box set. I got this back in October 2021, and the first thing I did was painted up my Kreig kill team. But at the time I didn't write down any of the method in detail because, well, I wasn't expecting to buy any more. Oh, how wrong I was. That didn't really work out because a few months later I picked up a second box of veterans. But they've been sitting around for a few months and I thought, well, it's time we got them painted. So to start, I gave my models a coat of black primer. Now, I would have preferred a grey primer, but I had trouble getting some and I'd run out of white, so I couldn't even mix my own. If you have grey primer, I'd recommend that, and then you can skip ahead and go straight to the base painting stage. Here I'm just giving a few light coats of white ink, thinned with about 2 drops of thinner to 1 drop of ink, just enough to give a light grey highlight. I don't want to build up to a bright white. To base coat the jacket, I'm going to use GW Base The Fang. Even though I'm using the airbrush version of this paint, I'm still going to thin it down on a 1:1 ratio. I start with 2 drops of Vallejo airbrush flow improver. Then I add 10 drops of thinner, and then 12 drops of paint. Now, you don't have to do this stage by airbrush. I did this via airbrush because I was priming and base coating other models, so the equipment was already out, but it's also a good way of practicing airbrush control. Once dry, I paint the other areas in Vallejo heavy charcoal and GW Corax white. You only need 1 thin coat of each here, because you really want to preserve as much detail as possible. Now for the gas mask, bedroll and leg wraps, I'm going to give these a single coat of Vallejo Game Leather Brown. This isn't a very strong paint, but don't worry if your coat's not too even, you really only need a single coat, and you'll see why later on. The backpack, shoes, gloves and cuffs are going to be given a coat of GW Base Rhinox Hide. Oh, and don't forget any straps. Next, we give all of these areas a wash. Anything brown gets a coat of GW Agrax Earthshade. Don't worry too much about overspill, just don't let it pull too much. Anything black or grey gets a coat of GW Nuln Oil. Before finally giving the jacket a wash of GW Drakenhof Nightshade. Once again, don't let it pull too much, just make sure you get it into all the folds of the fabric. So after giving that a little time to dry, we're going to start highlighting. And I'm going to start with the jacket, because it's actually quite easy. So we're going to go over all the raised areas with the original base colour of GW The Fang. Thin this down with about 2 brushfuls of water and 1 brush of paint. You don't want to create a glaze, just a thin paint. So it's a little hard to show on camera, but what you're trying to do is just paint the raised areas of the jacket and avoid those creases completely. You can always reapply the shade to a specific area if you make a mistake, so don't worry too much. Here's 2 examples of what you're trying to achieve. For edge highlighting, I'm going to be using GW Layer Russ Grey. When it comes to the smaller scale miniatures, I think the saying less is more is very true here. These aren't Space Marines, and I think if you do too much highlighting on fabric, it just looks unnatural. So using the edge of your brush where possible, give only the most raised areas a thin highlight. For example, the lapels, the trims and the creases on the hips and elbows. Where you can't use the edge of your brush, keep it perpendicular, wipe off the excess paint and use the very tip of your brush. For the trousers, we're going to apply the highlight in exactly the same way and use GW Layer Eshin Grey. And just like the jacket, paint the raised folds of fabric towards the knee. The helmet and armour plates get a very thin coat of Vallejo heavy charcoal. Avoid painting right to the edges and only paint the flat areas. For For the leather brown items, I'm going to use a thin layer of Vallejo Extra Opaque Heavy Brown. Once again, stick to the raised areas. The bedroll's the easiest, but the gas mask and leg wraps can be a little bit more tricky. It's quite hard to show this on camera, but keep the gas mask highlights on the cheekbones, just under the lenses. And for the leg wraps, paint a thin line on the lower part of each wrap. Now it's really easy to cover up any mistakes you make whenever it comes to basing, so don't worry too much. Now just like my Space Marines, any areas of Rhinox Hide get an edge highlight of GW layer Mournefang brown. Any areas too small to edge highlight like the shoulder straps or fingers, just give them a thin coat in the middle. For the helmet and shoulder pads, I'm going to give them a thin highlight with GW layer Dawnstone. For anything I want in metallic, I've been itching to try Scale 75's black metal. This is a great alternative to GW Iron Warriors. It thins really well with water, and it even works very well in an airbrush. I'm going to keep it to a minimum and just paint the voice box, the gas mask hose, the gun barrels and the buckles. And to add a little bit more colour, I'm just going to paint the emblems on the backpack and his belt buckle in Vallejo Game Hammered Copper. So, we're nearly there, on to the basing. So the base is created using GW Technical Agrellan Badlands. Because these are for kill team, I'm going to keep the edges clean so I can paint their names onto the edges later. Once the technical paint has dried, give that a wash of GW Agrax Earthshade. Now in my previous video I mentioned that I dry brushed this with only one colour, but in retrospect I think that was incorrect. So to bring a little colour back into the base, I'm going to dry brush with Vallejo Heavy Brown. Then, once that's dry, I give it a second dry brush of Vallejo Game Bronzed Flesh. For the dirt effect, I just dry brush upwards along the legs and the edges of the coat. Once again, less is more works best here. And then I apply a few coats of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. And that's it, we're done. This is a really nice simple recipe. It doesn't take too long to complete, and it really helps to make the kill team pop. Even without the transfers, I think these models look amazing. Now there's a few minor differences in how I painted the first batch of miniatures to the new ones, but they don't look out of place with their squad mates. So I hope this has been of use to you and given you some ideas on how you can paint your own Death Korps of Kreig. If it has, please consider leaving a comment or subscribing for more videos in the future. So, as always, enjoy your painting, have fun, and I'll see you soon.